And with that, we'll open the floor to any questions or comments.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I just have a quick housekeeping piece for verbal comments and questions, and we're going to limit those to 2 minutes each. And I have a list that I've started from people who have mentioned that they want to speak. If you would like to speak and you haven't yet reached out to me, you can do so in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and that will get to the raise hands as soon as I get through my list. Excellent. So with that, our first person will be Brian Bird. And I'll start your 2 minutes when you start speaking.
All right, thank you very much. I hope that you can hear me. My name is Brian Bird. I'm with Defenders of Wildlife in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm the Southwest Program Director. I want to thank you all and express our genuine gratitude that you all have put so much into this. And before I make a comment, I want to recognize Representative Georgene Lewis and Senator Mimi Stewart, who were the legislators that carried the Wildlife Corridors Act to the final finish line, and then, of course, Governor Lujan Grisham for her signing of the bill. A lot of other people were involved, and much appreciation to them too, but especially to the team that put together this report. You know, this is something a lot of us have been sort of dreaming about for many, many years and trying to put the pieces together, and you all really did a spectacular job. It's science-based, and it has incredible graphics and information in there. I think it'll serve as a resource for many, many years to come. It also puts New Mexico sort of on the map with wildlife corridors and safe passages for highway travel. A lot of other states are looking at New Mexico right now as a leader in this area because of this report. It's the first time I think we've seen such a report for a state. So thank you very much for all your hard work on this. And I just want to make a suggestion that possibly in the final draft, you include some type of appendix or information that would sort of elucidate funding sources for doing this work, because I think the next big challenge is going to be pulling the funding together to do these really important projects. So putting something into the report on possible funding sources would be really helpful. Thank you very much for your time tonight.
And thank you, and perfect timing. Your timer is up right now. So, there it is. With that, we'll go to the next person on my list, which is, and please restate your name, especially if I mispronounce it, Peter Collin.
You're on mute, Peter.
Go. Hello, good evening. This is Peter Callan with Pathways Wildlife Corridors of New Mexico. And we're a nonprofit, all-volunteer organization that got started in 2009, wanting to identify and protect wildlife corridors. So echoing Brian's comment, thank you very much for all of your hard work. And so sorry to hear about your losses, Patricia. It's good to see you and all the other panelists. For my comment, I mainly want to stress that in this whole taking, I think that it may seem obvious to us who are working on this, but for the public at large and for all the people that we need help from, which, you know, a lot of private landowners, a lot of the public support that we're looking for, we need the understanding. I think that is the first thing to focus on, the understanding that animals have moved and still need to move between the mountain ranges of New Mexico, that animal movement doesn't stop at the end of a mountain range. They need food and water and suitable mates. There's always a reason to go further to the next group of mountains or the next river valley. And climate change makes this even more urgent, forcing animals to move further north or out of a drought area or into an area that did receive rain or snow. So understanding this, that animals need to move between the mountains, I think needs to come first, because with that understanding, then cooperation is possible. And I don't think it's possible to cooperate across agency and public-private boundaries without understanding the needs of the animals. So as far as what you've listed as priorities, we here at Pathways want to thank you again for recognizing the importance of finding a connection between the Jemez and Sandia Mountains, and for recognizing the importance of the Crest of Montezuma corridor as that last open, unimpeded bit of land going to and from Sandia Mountain. It doesn't need to be engineered, it already exists. We just have to recognize and protect it for the valuable corridor that it is.
Thank you,
And-
Peter.
Okay, is that my time?
Yeah, the time has been up.
Okay.
Can you wrap it up in like just a few seconds?
Sure, just another area like this that I would like you to look at again is the 285-84 north of Santa Fe, just a couple miles north of Pewaukee, as another area. I know there was a lot of crash data there and it wasn't selected, but I'd like to take another look at that.
Excellent.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much. And sorry for the time limit. If you do have anyone has an extended comment they want to submit, you can submit that via email. There's information on the website. I'll repost that in the chat. So thank you so much. And I'll go to the next verbal comment. Jesse Dubell, please let me know how to pronounce your name.
Thank you very much, Sandra. You pronounced it perfectly. This is Jesse Dubell, Executive Director of the New Mexico Wildlife Federation. And consistent with the previous two commenters, I would really like to commend this team for doing an incredible job building out a very thorough and comprehensive report. Special appreciation for Mark Watson, who nobody knew was a professional photographer in addition to being an incredible wildlife scientist. So thank you all very much. I also just want to mention that the New Mexico Wildlife Federation is on standby to support your work and to help you with whatever we can as far as community outreach, education. We are going to be hosting a wildlife corridor summit on March 24th and 25th in Albuquerque. Many of you have already, been talking about this. We've inquired with you. We'd like to invite folks to participate on panels and as keynote speakers and really welcome your feedback. But most importantly, I just want you all to know that the Wildlife Federation appreciates you and we want to help you out in every way we can. So please don't be shy about reaching out for whatever support we might be able to provide. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. And with that, we have two questions that were put in the comments that are related, and I think both of them will be addressed by Mr. Haviland, but I'll read those. One is, will the presentation be available after these live events, and can we post the slides to the website? Matt?
Yes, so I see Sandra just posted the website in the chat there. You can check that for the action plan, and this presentation will also be posted there probably after the public meeting on Thursday. So I say starting Friday, you'll probably find it on the website. Excellent.
Thank you very much for that. And it looks like our next, I saw a hand up by Jerry Monzingo. If you would like to provide public comment, you can do so now.
Jerry, you're muted.
That's okay. Jerry, if you'd like to actually provide, if you would like to provide public comment at a later time, just feel free to raise your hand or let me know in the chat. Next, we'll go on to another one that was in the chat. And it says, have coyote fatalities been taken into account in the planning? If not, why? If so, how? And I would like to hand this one off to Mark Watson.
Coyotes were not specifically addressed in the Wildlife Corridors Act. There were the 6 large mammal species that were defined in the Wildlife Corridors Act for us to focus on. which were again, mule deer or deer, elk, pronghorn, black bear, cougar, and bighorn sheep, both desert and Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep subspecies. So coyotes were not defined within the act. We developed a species of concern list that includes a lot of different small and medium-sized carnivores. I think most of our fox species in the state and other wildlife. We did not choose to include coyotes as a species of concern because they're widespread and common across the state. Unfortunately, they do get hit a lot, and I think that's, you know, certainly the carnivore that we see hit on the highways most. But the good news is that any of these projects that become implemented with wildlife passages, underpasses, and overpasses will benefit coyotes. They use overpasses and underpasses, and New Mexico Department of Transportation has documented many of them as the monitoring was done in many of our underpasses in our 10 projects across the state. They regularly use our crossings, including the crosswalk in Tijeros Canyon.
Thank you very much. Do any of our other panelists have anything to add to that question?
I'll just mention that, yes, I work in many Western states monitoring wildlife crossing structures, and coyotes are the superb generalist, and they will be around a lot longer than we will. And so they will adapt to the different crossing structures that we put there for those 6 focal species.
Thank you very much. Next in line, I have verbal comment from Caitlin Bradley. Give me a second. There you go.
Good evening. Thank you for the presentation and thank you for the opportunity. I kind of have a combination of comment and some questions, but I work with New Mexico Farm and Livestock Bureau, and we really appreciate the recognition in this plan of private property rights and working cooperatively with those private landowners on these initiatives. I am curious if you could provide some information on what that process looks like of how you're planning to work with those private landowners. And I also, as you were talking about predators, I was curious if you all gathered data on the impact of increased predator movement through these initiatives, and if that is something that private landowners, especially those that have livestock, will be made aware of if this is, you know, to go forward. Thank you.
First
Thank you very
part's
much.
probably a question for Matt, I would say.
Yes, that's the working with private landowners. Yeah, so there should be a lot of opportunities for that, and you know, that's really going to be on a kind of project-specific basis. You know, once we actually get into the design phase of these projects, and we know exactly where each structure is going to be placed, then you know that'll be a good chance to actually open the door for discussions with private landowners.
I guess I would add to that, from my experience working with DOT on implementing projects, you know, generally in retrofits where fencing is added to direct wildlife to existing bridges, to go underneath existing bridges, retrofitting culverts from small corrugated metal culverts up to larger size culverts that wildlife will readily move through, that does not constitute any kind of sacrifice of private land. Those projects have all been done within the existing right-of-way. I think for projects that we're proposing through the Wildlife Corridors Act draft action plan that implement overpasses, there will need to be negotiations with private landowners if we've located potential overpass locations that have surrounding private lands, because that could extend, you know, to build an overpass, a wildlife dedicated overpass, it's probably going to extend on both sides beyond the right of way, depending on the highway and the locality. But again, you know, private landowner voluntary participation is a key component of the Wildlife Corridors Act. So those negotiations would go on a project by project basis, as Matt suggested?
As a researcher, Caitlin, your question is actually about predators is the most often question I get in my meetings. The predators don't come and congregate at wildlife crossing structures because a predator on the side of the road is a dead predator. People shoot them, as you probably know, anybody, coyote, et cetera, are going to get shot if they're hanging out waiting for that mule deer to come through. So I have monitored over 100 structures in, I'm not sure how many, half a dozen states, millions and millions of photographs, and very rarely, and I will say one instance of a mountain lion had picked off an animal near a structure, but otherwise they do not stay near structures. They go through them and they keep moving through, but there's not this, the only place I've seen a congregation of predators is in Florida, where the alligators were waiting down at the end of the culvert where the water was. But we don't have to worry about that in New Mexico. So it does not bring them to the road.
Thank you very much. Any other input from our panelists?
Yeah, let me add just a little bit about carnivores and predators. Maybe one carnivore to think of for movements is the mountain lion or cougar, but this is going to be true also of black bears and many other carnivores. So the cougar, for example, mostly is mostly associated with again, rugged topography, desert and other mountain ranges, and the subadults, the males particularly, they do seek a home range that is far away from where they were born. The females tend to stay closer to where they were born. This is one mechanism. It's called philopatry, which prevents inbreeding, but in between the mountain ranges or the patches of suitable habitat are stepping stones of corridor habitat, and the predators, the mountain lions and other carnivores, they don't linger. They just try to reach the next mountain range.
Thank you very much, Jean-Luc. Next, I have verbal comment from Michael Dax. Your time will start when you start speaking.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Want to reiterate everyone else's appreciation for all the hard work that went into the plan. My question is about how the plan will be updated going forward, both kind of the general requirement in the statutory language for an annual report, as well as some more specific considerations around the collar data that Game and Fish has been collecting over the last couple of years, both under Secretarial Order 3362 as well as through other funds. It seems like there's a whole lot more data that the department will have access to in the coming years. And I'm curious how that will inform future iterations of the report, of the linkages modeling, or any other aspects.
Do you want to take the first part, Matt?
Yeah. So as far as the annual reports and updating the actual plan, we are required to submit annual reports to the governor and the legislator each year. And, in that report, we'll discuss, the progress that we've made, kind of put in terms of percentages complete for each project. And then, as far as updating the plan, the act says that we only have to update it the first 10 years or after 10 years, but we'll probably do it more often than that. As we kind of complete plans or the projects, at least partially, then we'll probably adjust and reprioritize a little bit the actual action plan itself. And I'll let Mark elaborate on collar data.
And Michael, for the second part of your question, you know, New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, as you stated, has been putting out a lot of collars on mule deer, pronghorn, and elk. But I think the areas that those collars have been going out in are still pretty narrowly confined to northern New Mexico. And so there's not a lot of data for a lot of parts of the state on big game movements, potential migration corridors, you know, elevational migrations, seasonal movements. There are other researchers like Jimmy Kane that has put collars out in the Jemez and, you know, hundreds of collars on elk that his students had put on in the Gila. So a lot of that data, I think, is still considered preliminary, but after 3 to 5 years, I think, you know, that data will be publishable. And in fact, I think a lot of our data in the north central part of the state will be published in a USGS publication. It'll be the second volume that documents migratory movements of big game animals in the western US. So I can, you know, I'm sure we will continue to put out collars as that money becomes available through the secretarial order and through other funding mechanisms. And I can foresee probably an opportunity in the relatively near future to have some kind of data sharing agreement with Matt. He's a GIS whiz where he can, you know, access the data that's, you know, that's publicly available that we're putting out and be able to use that data for implementing the Wildlife Corridors Act.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question, Michael?
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure if I was back on mute. Yeah, mostly. So for the habitat linkages, you know, I think that was all kind of modeling. Will there be any kind of ground truthing using that collar data, at least for places where collared animals line up with those models, realizing that it's not statewide?
You know, I can't really speak for the Wildlife Management Division, that the big game program that's doing all that work, but sort of my sense and my understanding is they are focusing on our Secretarial Order 3362 priority areas, and the northeast part of the state is a priority area. And in fact, that's why we included it, you know, the Pronghorn Triangle, as one of our top 6 wildlife corridors. So I don't think collars will be put out on localized herds of animals just to better define priorities that we've identified in the action plan. But there is some alignment between the areas that we've selected and the areas that are priorities for our big game program. So there will be collars put out in those areas in the future, I suspect. Some of those areas.
And I also want to clarify that let's talk about our 6 corridors. I'll go down them off the top of my head to make sure it's understood. Number 1, Chalma, tremendous decades of GPS collar data. What went into the selection of that? It came a lot from the Jicarilla tribe. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay. They have decades. They have reports and data they shared with us. Game and Fish has data on animals on the other side of US 84 and 64. So tremendous amount of collar data for there. Then the next one, Ova del Norte, collar data again on animals that Game and Fish collared recently with money from Secretary Order 3362. We know exactly where the 3 species are going across the road. Next one down, Pronghorn Triangle. We don't have a lot of collar data. And again, it was identified in the secretarial order linkages as important to the state for pronghorn. So that one could use some, but like Mark said, we may not have collars put on just to verify that particular corridor. Let's go down to Peloncillo Mountains, as I mentioned in the slideshow. Collar data from Bighorn, Desert Bighorn, north and south of the road. We've got that figured out, that they don't go across the road. So that was another major support for that corridor. Let's go to the Sandia Jemez. Oh my gosh. 5 species of our focal 6 species were collared by our colleagues on the Pueblo of Santa Ana. And that was a major reason that we knew exactly where animals needed to go, as well as Jimmy Kane and his colleagues' data on mountain lions from the south in the Sandia Mountains, as well as Peter Callan and colleagues' data on, they have camera traps showing the animals in that mountain range. So that one was highly supported by data, not just modeling. And then the very last corridor up in the Cuestas, we didn't have collared animals, but we've got literally bighorn sheep hanging out on the road. So it was a visual as well as a number of animals getting killed. So to tell you the truth, we had a lot of data that went in to really support those linkages, and which became corridors, which are much more narrow across the road. So we really tried not to do just models, because models are hypotheses of what humans think, but we backed it up with data. So if Game and Fish wants to put some more collars out, great, but we feel very confident that what we got you is very well documented as places animals move.
Thank you. Any other input from our panelists? Hearing none, I'll go to our next person on my list, which is a verbal comment from David Cox. David, you can unmute if you'd like to speak.
I did. Hello, thank you. As a resident here in Glorieta, I'm really encouraged to see that our area is one of the areas you're considering. It's a weekly heartbreak to travel down the road and see animals on the side of the road. I'm wondering, I'm curious about the Steins Corners area. It sounds, am I correct in assuming that there are two isolated groups of sheep and that they're not crossing the road? I'm wondering what will you hope to achieve, and what are tangible results of making a crossing in that area? Thank you.
I can take that. Arizona Game and Fish has desert bighorn sheep that are radio collared on the north side of the highway. New Mexico Game and Fish has sheep on the south side, and those sheep almost literally are looking at each other, but they can't connect because I-10 has a very high traffic volume, 24 hours a day. It's a major east-west trucking route. And as Patty was saying, bighorn sheep generally will not use underpasses, large culverts. They need overpasses. So it's probably going to be potentially the most difficult project to implement that we've recommended, because unfortunately the freeway parallels the railroad through that area. So we're going to have to figure out how to install a couple of overpasses, at least one, and allow animals to negotiate the railroad tracks also, which kind of throws another uncertainty into it. But many projects have been implemented around the West and well monitored and researched. Patty's been involved in them, as well as one of our other partners, Jeff Gagnon and his crew with Arizona Game and Fish. And we know bighorn sheep readily use overpasses. So it's not something uncertain that you can install an overpass and expect bighorn sheep or other big game animals to use it. It's been done many times throughout the West. It's more of a local engineering issue consideration, and working with railroad, the railroad company is a totally different animal from working with DOT. And we at Game and Fish have a little bit of experience with that. We worked with Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad in Abo Canyon, where we had over 20 bighorn sheep that had been hit by trains going through Abo Canyon in the central Manzano Mountains there. And that track was limited to one track. And so BNSF came in and put in a second track, and we worked with them to install polygons of 8-foot tall fence to force wildlife to use a series of 7 trestles, large bridges, throughout the length of the 5-mile canyon. And since they did that, we haven't had, as far as I know, we have not had any bighorn mortalities. So we do have some experience working with the railroad, but it's a little bit harder project to design and implement. It will take local partners that support implementing those projects locally. And I think we have some NGOs and potentially private landowners that are interested in a project at Steins. And, you know, we just need to see what we can do, basically. But we've kind of set the ground level footing for where overpasses can go and where underpasses can be expanded.
And David, another thing that we do in the transportation and ecology world, and certainly totally in the transportation world, is we set performance measures for transportation projects. So when we do something with wildlife, before the project starts, we say, how are we going to define success? And I can tell you, those of you in the nonprofit world, get your stories ready for when that first bighorn sheep goes over that overpass someday. That'll be a victory. So you'll have the rams will probably come first. That's one performance measure, but then we want the entire population of the ewes and the lambs to go over across as well. And that's why we're building overpasses, because rams can go underneath the road, but the rest of the population doesn't. So that would be a performance measures to get ages and genders of different species, particularly the bighorn, desert bighorn, to go across the overpass. And of course, there will be lots of people jumping up and down if we get to see some of the carnivores, Mexico, coming up through those mountains as well. So camera data, there's not a lot of crash data there because as Mark said, the traffic volume is so high that we don't have a lot of crashes. So we're mostly going to measure the performance measures with cameras to see who comes through.
Thank you very much. Any other input from our panelists?
I guess, did we answer your question?
Oh, yes, definitely. Is there a good example? Is Arizona a good example where if a person were curious and they wanted to see a robust overpass that's effective, or Colorado, or are there states that are kind of in the vanguard right now?
Arizona, for sure. I think that was one of the first sort of bighorn dedicated overpasses or series of overpasses that were installed by ADOT. And Arizona Game and Fish monitored that. And as Patty was alluding to, the real excitement was when the video camera got a tiny little lamb that was just a couple of hours old, following behind the ewe across the overpass. It was really a striking video and, success story. But that series of overpasses, I believe, is at Highway 93. They had to reroute a highway around Hoover Dam right through desert bighorn habitat. And so there's 2 or 3 overpasses there.
And then Arizona Game and Fish helped Nevada with desert bighorn overpasses in the corner of Nevada for this new Interstate 11 going to Las Vegas, and they have desert bighorn using them. And then I helped research a project in State Highway 9 in Colorado, where there's the Rocky Mountain bighorn, and there's 2 overpasses in that project. And we have pictures of entire tiny little herds of all 3 age classes, or, we've got the ewes, the lambs, and the rams all coming together. So yes, we do have evidence of them using overpasses in the nearby states.
Thank you. The next question I have on my list is in regards to OHVs and ATV use in New Mexico. We're asking for our panelists to elaborate on the effects on wildlife and/or state highways.
It seems like a general question, but from the wildlife point of view, what I could talk to is that we in the appendix of the Wildlife Corridors Action Plan, we go through all the types of mitigation so that you understand what we're talking about. And we've got a picture in there where Arizona put concrete or metal or wood posts all around the entrance to an underpass so that ATVs could not fit through it, so that they minimize the amount of motorized vehicles going through it, but animals and people could walk right there. So I mean, that's a problem for people driving through with motorized vehicles for crossing structures, but I'm not exactly sure if that was the question.
Thank you. If that did not answer the question, just please add elaboration in the chat.
And I would add that the monitoring that New Mexico Department of Transportation is doing at many of the underpasses have documented some ATVs on US 550 south of Cuba. It seems to be fairly limited to just one of two bridges. So generally that's not an issue, but you do everything you can to try and avoid, human use of these underpasses because it can have some effect on wildlife use of them if it gets too frequent.
Excellent. And then our next question is specifically addressed to Matt, asking if NMDOT will be requesting general appropriation funds from the state and if the Federal Wildlife Crossing Fund will be applied for.
Yes, so actually this plan is coming out at a very opportune time, with the passage of the new federal
Infrastructure.
transportation bill, I guess. Because there is $350 million dedicated for wildlife crossings specifically. And so we've already got, kind of ahead of the curve here with this plan, with, kind of projects that are in the conceptual stage at the very least. So we will be very competitive for the federal funding. As far as requesting money from the state, we do plan on pursuing that pathway as well. Probably each year, we will try to at least get something done just using state funds. But the state funds could also be used as matching funds for federal dollars as well. So we do plan on pursuing that path as well.
And the infrastructure bill that was passed recently has $350 million of competitive funding for wildlife passage projects, as well as the transportation bill that I don't think has been passed yet.
Thank you. The next question is kind of circling back to Caitlin Spradley's questions and asking whether or not the proposed changes and overpasses will bring more predators into livestock areas.
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure if we completely answered her question. My sense is, certainly the building of overpasses and underpasses, wildlife passages, is not going to increase the population of predators. You're not going to see, an increased number of carnivores. It allows them to move back and forth across the highway and continue moving in their home range. And an example that comes to mind is Dr. Travis Perry with Furman University radio collared with a GPS collar, a cougar on Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque. And this was probably 5 or 6 years ago, and documented that cougar moving across I-40 into the Sandias where he apparently had a female. And then westward across I-25 at Sandia Pueblo, where he apparently had a female in the Bosque. And he would stay there for a couple of weeks, and then he moved back to the Sandias and then back to Kirtland. And he did that movement 3 or 4 times before he was finally hit on the highway. So, these carnivores are very elusive. They're mostly nocturnal. It's pretty rare to see cougars. I've never seen one in the wild, a live one. So I don't think you can really make a case that it's going to increase predators on any one property as a result of these passages.
Thank you. Any other input from our panelists? Okay. The next question is states, retrofit seems like an inexpensive low-hanging fruit. Will these projects be prioritized because of their low costs?
Yeah, so I think probably each one of our projects does include some retrofits that could be addressed separately, whether it's just a bridge that has some wing fence to help kind of guide wildlife to it. But we don't want to be, or we want to be careful about constructing a partial project that's not going to be highly effective. But there will be plenty of opportunities just to actually address that low hanging fruit, as you put it, just by kind of adding some fence or even upsizing a culvert, especially if we piggyback on a planned road project that is going to be addressing drainage issues anyways. If that answers the question.
If not, let me know in the chat. Thank you. The next question I have states, the Sandia Jemez Mountains area has a number of existing and proposed transmission lines and petroleum/natural gas pipelines. Are there mitigation measures for these in the draft? And the second part is, will the proposed project affect future development in these areas?
I think the first part of that's a Matt question.
Yeah, so DOT is very well versed in dealing with existing utilities, whether it's transmission lines or pipelines. Either we can find ways to work around them, or sometimes we actually relocate them, especially transmission lines. So that will be something that's going to be addressed as we design a project. There might be certain situations to where we just can't. We can't actually do that, and that might change our actual design slightly.
Patty probably has more to add to this, but sort of Wildlife Passage 101 is you never build a wildlife overpass where they're going to build a Walmart on the other side. You always have to have some level of certainty that you're not going to spend $10 million on a wildlife dedicated overpass and it's going to get developed. So the action plan, I think, does include language on working directly with landowners, willing voluntary landowners, to implement conservation easements on potentially small areas of their property where wildlife dedicated overpasses could go in to try and protect these areas from development, or entire ranches in some cases. But that would be completely voluntary by the landowner.
Mark does raise a good point. If we're just going to retrofit a existing culvert or something, that's one thing. But if we are going to be building a $7 million overpass, we definitely want some kind of conservation easement in place to guarantee that that land won't be developed in the future. Thanks, Mark.
And to answer the question directly, I did not bring in consideration of proposed transmission lines and petroleum natural gas pipelines. So they weren't brought into the considerations because this is highly based on highways, but you can look in the act and kind of distill that this is also important. The transmission lines and gas and petroleum pipelines, I wouldn't want them out there, but they're not as detrimental to wildlife as 40,000 vehicles going on a road. So there may be some room for working together on these issues. But I've had a pipeline go in right next to a wildlife crossing in Utah, transmission lines, et cetera. They're just not as detrimental to wildlife as vehicles are. So that will be a battle for another day.
Thank you. And our next one is a clarifying question on the OHV question. It says, OHV use has grown exponentially in New Mexico, especially in hunting and recreational use, causing damage to roads, dams, etc. The question is that this person is just not sure if state approved use on state highway and roads will grow as well. And will that be considered in the plan to protect wildlife and infrastructure?
I would say that that seems like it's outside the scope of the Wildlife Corridors Act. Because that's, you know, that's legal travel now, according to New Mexico law on state highways. I think what we would want to do implementing these 11 recommended projects and other future projects is try to restrict or reduce ATV use through wildlife dedicated passages as much as possible, because that can, you know, severely affect wildlife use of those passages.
Thank you very much. The next question states Highway 285/84, 2 miles north of Pojoaque, Nambe, is low-hanging fruit for a crossing, one of the few areas for wildlife to cross 285. No other good connections between Sangre de Cristo and Jemez Mountains. Do you think this is a critical area to consider in the future?
It did show up, Patty, in the, I can't remember, the top 20 or something like that.
It's somewhere in the top 30 for collisions. And of course, you know, even if a project didn't make it in the top 11 on this priority project list, you know, we'll keep these projects in mind. So if a road project does come up in these areas and there is a opportunity to, you know, address, you know, some wildlife collision, you know, hotspot areas, you know, we'll try to take advantage of that as well.
And is that Tesuque or Pojoaque Pueblo lands?
Mhm.
Because they would, you know, they would need to be an advocate for those projects.
And that's actually something that it reminds me is Matt Haverland needs all of your assistance for the rest of his career with New Mexico DOT. These are men in there trying to persuade engineers, planners, administrators that wildlife need a fair shake too. And so you will be his best allies in the future to show that what he's asking for is valuable. And that's a perfect example of someplace that didn't make it at the top 10, but we should keep it in mind, especially if there's going to be an upcoming project. So always support Matt.
Thanks, Patty.
Excellent. Well, at this point, I don't see any other questions in the chat. Oh, okay. Good timing. All right, our next question is, what about bicyclists using these wildlife crossings? They are everywhere these days. Can you plan to have signage to deter all human and vehicles from using these crossings?
You know, Mark did touch on this earlier. You know, it definitely doesn't, it doesn't, human use or human presence doesn't mesh well with dedicated wildlife crossings. There could be situations in the future when working with private landowners that it might be a stipulation of theirs to allow some use. And, you know, that's going to be very situational. You know, we will try to keep it at a very minimal.
One example I can think of is there's an existing project on US 550 south of Cuba where there's 2 large bridges over the Rio Puerco, and some animals were already using those underpasses, but DOT installed about 4 miles of fence and an animal detection system on each end of the fence to warn motorists of end-run events. And one of those bridges has had some ATV use, and I think the southern bridge actually has plans for the Continental Divide Trail to go under it. But, you know, we consulted with DOT on the feasibility or, you know, the importance of that, or how or if that might adversely affect wildlife passage. And we just felt like, you know, the utilization of it by hikers along the Continental Divide Trail will probably be so few that it hopefully will not affect routine wildlife use of those passages. So it's definitely situational, case by case, as Matt said. I mean, you can't, I don't think DOT has the authority necessarily to legally control all use in underpasses. And a lot of these areas that get a lot of wildlife use are rural. So there's limitations on, law enforcement capacity to control that type of use, assuming DOT wanted to. And you just hope that those rural areas stay rural, because those are the best areas for wildlife movements, generally.
Thank you. Okay, now I don't see any other questions in the chat or raised hands. So final call, if you have a question that you'd like to ask our panelists. If you think of something afterwards, you can go ahead and contact us. Would you please put up the slide with the website and email? And I can post that information in the chat if you'd like. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, our panelists for doing such a great job answering all the questions and presenting all this information for you. Matt posted the email that you can provide additional comments to through March 12th and questions. And with that, thank you all for attending and have a good evening.